Good afternoon. My name is Brian Sweat, and I'm the ACCTivate Product Manager. Today we're going to spend about 1 hour going through the ACCTivate integration with QuickBooks, which you may also know of as the synchronization with QuickBooks. ACCTivate has a lot of functionality that is shared with QuickBooks, and today we'll go over some information about how those data transactions flow back and forth, some tips and tricks on how to best set up QuickBooks for use with ACCTivate, and then also how to manage your daily synchronization and how to read the log and hopefully get through some issues on your own and hopefully answer questions that you may have about QuickBooks. As a brief introduction, I do want to start off by reminding everyone with the concept of how ACCTivate was initiated to come work with QuickBooks. So long ago when we started with ACCTivate, we actually didn't start with QuickBooks. We started with some other accounting products in the past. As our business model is to not be the software that does everything, including the general ledger, payroll, and all the core accounting. Instead, ACCTivate is focused on adding operational and inventory management for customers that are already using a great platform in accounting software. So in this case, we're using QuickBooks is what we're going to cover today, but I did want to just give you some kind of overview of what we've done in the past to show why we do it the way we do it today. When the ACCTivate product was first created, the modern day ACCTivate, we started with a product called CIMA, Accounting for Windows, and that began in 1999. I joined the company in 2001, and that was our only standard integration we had at the time. And as you see on the left, the responsibilities of ACCTivate included the operational pieces of the business, including CRM, customer management, sales order, shipping, inventory, purchasing, and then some additional add-ons such as business activities, mobile, and e-commerce. And then in CIMA, we relied on them to do accounts receivable, accounts payable, and the general ledger. So when we created the integration to QuickBooks in 2004, we started with the exact same business model where ACCTivate is responsible for the operations. And then as you see on the right, that's what we're going to go through today, is how ACCTivate works with QuickBooks. So QuickBooks is the owner, is responsible for managing accounts receivable, payables, expenses that are not related to inventory, such as paying your bills, cutting checks to vendors, doing bank reconciliation, and of course payroll is not involved with ACCTivate at all. And in the middle of the Venn diagram, we have that list of data that is shared between QuickBooks and ACCTivate, such as codes, such as terms codes, customer types, sales tax information, all of that information that's shared between the products that both systems use quite a bit. And some of these records that we'll get into in a minute with a full list can actually be entered in either QuickBooks or ACCTivate, and they will be synchronized two ways between the two systems, such as customers, invoices, and that sort of transactions. And we're also adding yet a third integration today, which is Intact. And if you have any questions about Intact, we're going to cover that in another session. But Intact is the next step, I think, beyond QuickBooks. So if you have any advanced accounting needs that are beyond the scope of what QuickBooks can handle, we're often recommending the Intact software as a new web-based platform for accounting, including all the functionality in QuickBooks and a lot more. And ACCTivate also seamlessly integrates with Intact in the same concept as we've shown. And to expand on that Venn diagram a little bit, this is a chart. I'm just going to put it up here for a few minutes, but just to kind of give you an idea of the responsibilities of activating QuickBooks. Again, QuickBooks is responsible for the general ledger, so the GL accounts would be entered in QuickBooks, managed in QuickBooks, and that's the only place you're really going to manage that information. And the same goes with vendors. We've had customers ask for the ability to add new vendors in ACCTivate. It's not as common as customers, though, and for most businesses. When you set up a new relationship with a vendor, that's often a lot more complicated than just simply taking orders from a new customer. So if you kind of go through this list real quick, the data on the left is information that you can add in ACCTivate, and the X's only on the right are in QuickBooks only. There's a couple that are marked with a red star, such as sales invoices. You're more than welcome to continue entering sales invoices in QuickBooks as long as they don't touch the ACCTivate inventory. So we usually don't recommend that, but we understand there are scenarios where that is required. And toward the very bottom, we also have journal entries. I did want to throw that up there. We can talk about that a little bit kind of as a follow-up. The ACCTivate does generate new journal entries, but of course QuickBooks is used for doing like closing journal entries from your accountant or any of your bookkeeper's entries will always be entered in QuickBooks. Real quick, we'll go through the system requirements. ACCTivate does work with a number of the editions, including Pro, Premier, and Enterprise. Intuit previously had a product called Simple Start, which was not supported by the SDK. They also have the online edition, which we do not integrate with at this time. If you are interested in online, you can let us know, but it's usually not an upgrade from Pro, Premier, or Enterprise. So if you're using one of these products, these are kind of the mid-market. We also do not integrate with the QuickBooks Mac edition. Intuit has not provided a software development kit, an SDK, for third parties to integrate with it. As for international editions, we do work with US, Canada, UK, South Africa, and Australia. Those are different branded versions of QuickBooks, so it's a little different. You actually have to buy a different product. But it is interesting. We're seeing a number of even US companies that are actually acquiring an international branch or an international company and becomes a new branch office. So if you're doing business in Canada or doing business in the UK with a local office, you may be able to use ACCTivate but integrated with those different versions of QuickBooks. So if you have that need, please contact our sales team and we can explain how that works. But just be aware that ACCTivate is definitely international with support for VAT, multi-currency, and all the requirements of those country editions. Now, the other system requirement that should be fine, most of you should fall under this without any problems, but ACCTivate supports QuickBooks 2008 or 8.0 for enterprise or later. We know that we have some customers that are still running on older versions of QuickBooks, and we would strongly encourage you to upgrade. In fact, we're actually adding some warnings that will let you know if you are running on an unsupported version of QuickBooks. And in Canada and the UK, the version numbers are a little different. So 2009 corresponds to the US 2008. So if you're in Canada, you need to be on 2009 or later. And then Australia is the same thing. It's a couple years newer in terms of the year, but it really is the same as the 2008 US. One thing at the very bottom here, on our help site, again, if you go to help.activate.com, you can search for system requirements. We have an entire list with a lot more information about what version of QuickBooks we support, so we can just move past that. Okay, QuickBooks must be installed to synchronize. This comes up a lot, especially for new accounts. The way ACCTivate works, we have a centralized database that you can get to from any computer on your network that has ACCTivate. QuickBooks works the same way. They have a centralized database or data file. You may be more accustomed to using that term. The QuickBooks software must be installed on the local workstation where you want to synchronize with the ACCTivate database. The good news is only one user in your office is required to sync, and maybe you'll have one or two as a backup in case that person's out sick or unavailable for some time. So when that user synchronizes with QuickBooks, it synchronizes the data between the two databases and it makes it instantly available for all the other users on your network. So just because you're using ACCTivate, that does not mean you have to put QuickBooks on every computer. Another thing is, as we get into QuickBooks, I'll show you, we would recommend that you create a new user account called ACCTivate. And there's one reason for that is that ACCTivate can synchronize with QuickBooks even when it's not running. So if QuickBooks is running, we will synchronize using the credentials of the active user. If QuickBooks is not opened and not running, ACCTivate can be configured to synchronize in the background with QuickBooks, but you'll have to specify which user account to be synchronized as. Now, the reason why I think that's important to set up this ACCTivate user is that will appear in audit logs and in the database in QuickBooks, so there's a way of knowing where that data came from. So if you're not logged into QuickBooks, it's hard to tell what user you're synchronizing as. So rather than using admin or any of your named users, we'll show you how to set up the ACCTivate user as a backend option. Another thing to note, and this was changed recently in the ACCTivate 8.1.1 software update, and then again in QuickBooks 2011 R7. Windows User Account Control, for those of you that are not familiar with that term, UAC, it is the pop-ups that happen in Windows when software needs to make a change to your system registry or any system files. So it's the "Are you sure?" prompt with a yes and no that you're going to see all the time. So the UAC prompts prior to 8.1.1 in 2011, you had to have user access control enabled in order to run sync. But we ran into a number of customers, usually more advanced, more technical people, that wanted to disable UAC, but you couldn't do that. Activate Sync would not work with UAC disabled, and that was changed in the newer QuickBooks release about almost 2 years ago, and then also in the Activate 8.1.1 software update. And lastly, this one is very complicated and brings up a lot of questions, but I really would like to get it out there so you can think about it. If you would like to centralize your QuickBooks and make it available for multiple users on your network, Terminal Services is a good option for that. And that allows you to have a single server where QuickBooks is installed and allow multiple users to connect to that single server to run QuickBooks. Now, there's one caveat to that, which is that QuickBooks Enterprise Solutions, QBES, is required for you to run on your local terminal server. Otherwise, you can look at a certified hosting partner such as Right Networks or InSync. Those companies have worked out a deal with Intuit to provide QuickBooks Pro and Premier available on terminal services. And you may also know that as remote desktop. If you have that need, please let us know if you have any technical questions, but I would contact Right Networks or InSync to see if they can help you out to set up remote desktop. Okay, now moving on a little bit to more technical improvements that I've seen in QuickBooks. One thing that I'll tell you to do when you have QuickBooks running, I think you might need to be administrator, but I've seen it work for other lower level users. In QuickBooks, you can press F2 at any time to show the product information window. And one of the things you'll want to note on there is where's the location of your QuickBooks data file? Is it on a fast hard drive? Is it a drive that's going to perform really well and make sure it has plenty of disk space? Also, to perform really well with QuickBooks, we found that if you close windows in QuickBooks when you're running synchronization, that will actually make it run a lot faster. And the reason for that is that QuickBooks will auto refresh in the background every time we add a new record or delete a record or change a record. So if you close those windows, such as like a report, a quick report, or the customer or vendor center, you may notice that QuickBooks Sync runs a little faster. Obviously, this is not possible in all cases, but if you have to do a major synchronization with QuickBooks for some reason, single user mode will obviously avoid conflicts. So if you're trying to write, 1,000 new invoices or 5,000 invoices, and you have other users creating records in QuickBooks, single user mode will guarantee that you'll avoid any conflicts. So that's just something to keep in mind, although we understand that it's kind of a pain to switch from multi to single user. This one, I can say for a fact I've seen it, I've tested it, I've timed it. QuickBooks Enterprise is also faster than Pro and Premier. I say that with a kind of a catch-22. Activate doesn't do anything differently between Pro, Premier, and Enterprise. So there's no feature or functionality benefit to getting Enterprise in terms of Activate. However, we have found that once your company's financials are quite large, Pro does slow down. And as soon as you upgrade your data file to Enterprise, it actually performs faster. There's not a lot of good detailed data explaining why, but it is definitely faster. And we've seen that in numerous tests in terms of querying data and also writing to the database. The other thing that I also say with kind of it's a double-edged sword, if you have a very old QuickBooks file, you might want to consider doing a verify and rebuild and potentially condense. These utilities are definitely a little more advanced for a normal QuickBooks file, and damage could come from your data file as well. So you have to back up first, make sure you have a really good backup. But if you are having problems in QuickBooks, I would encourage you to take a look at the verify and rebuild. And that's on the utilities menu of the file menu. The last segment is the DB file fragments. This is another thing that's kind of complicated. QuickBooks has a regular data file that's on your hard drive on your server. And problems with that file sometimes happen outside of the scope of QuickBooks, such as your Windows file server. Let's say that you start running low on disk space. Well, Windows, the file system, the NT file system, will often fragment a data file, large files, to be in different spots, different locations on your hard disk. So in QuickBooks, if you press F2, there's a section called DB file fragments, and we really want that number to be very small. I've heard a couple different comments about that. It should be less than 10 or less than 20. Really, if it's a large number, 100 or 200, I definitely would recommend you look at doing disk maintenance on your server and see if there's any way you can get that file to be contiguous. And that's something you should work with your IT company to find out why you have so many file fragments on your server. Also, I've known in the past that simply moving the file or doing a rebuild, doing any maintenance on the file may cause it to move the data around. So just something to be aware of. If you have a lot of performance problems, look at the DB file fragments and then consider working with Intuit support to work on that. Okay, now I'm going to get into more of the guts of synchronization, and we'll go through this in the demo, so we'll cover this pretty quickly. But just want to point out, this is something you'll see on the screen a lot, but you can get really creative with the way ACCTivate creates QuickBooks items for sales invoices. Just be aware that we use the product class ID as the QuickBooks item. And there's a reason we do that, is QuickBooks doesn't perform very well with large lists. So if you had 500,000 products or maybe even 1 million products in ACCTivate, we wouldn't want to create 1 million items in your QuickBooks list. So what we've done is we've just simplified that by synchronizing with the groups, the product classes, as the QuickBooks items. So if you want to have any additional details on your QuickBooks sales invoice, you'll actually need to create multiple product classes to cover that detail level. And the description will still have the full ACCTivate product ID and description. So you're not going to lose that data. It's just going to make it a little less detailed for QuickBooks reports. Also, if you've been using QuickBooks very long, you'll understand that unique list names are definitely a requirement. So you cannot have a customer and a vendor with the same name. If you are trading with a single company, what we recommend is using the vendor in parentheses suffix for the vendor name. So it would be, Abercrombie could be a customer name, and then the vendor name would be Abercrombie vendor in parentheses. And you'll see that on the screen. That's actually pretty easy to do. I can even show you on the screen as we move into that. And then lastly, on the lists and transactions here, I've got just some field names to be aware of. QuickBooks uses the term list ID and TXN ID, so you may see that in log files or even on screen sometimes in ACCTivate. That is an internal key for QuickBooks. You shouldn't need to worry about that too much, but just be aware that that allows you to rename customers, vendors, change an invoice number. In ACCTivate, we'll have the direct link to that record because we actually link on the list ID or the TXN ID. So feel free to rename records. You shouldn't have any problem with that. And ACCTivate does the same. We use the word GUID. That's more the Microsoft term for a globally unique identifier, and that is our internal key. And by talking about renames, some changes are allowed in QuickBooks to records that we create. So for example, invoices are the hot one that usually comes up in discussion. You can change like the due date. There's no problem with that. But if you were to change the invoice date, we would not support that because changing the invoice date will not flow back in through inventory if you do it in QuickBooks. So you should void the invoice, adjust the invoice, and then recreate it. So that's just one thing to put out there. Dates are a common thing that come up. Also, don't change quantities and amounts in QuickBooks for inventory transactions from ACCTivate. If you simply open up a journal entry for an inventory receipt and you change it from $100 to $200, ACCTivate's not going to know what to do with that. So just be really aware that changes in QuickBooks for ACCTivate transactions are not recommended. ACCTivate uses the QuickBooks user, as I mentioned before. So if you sync as an administrator, you'll have full access to create any type of transaction. But if you are in QuickBooks as your named user account, you may have restricted access to certain areas. So if you see these little red icons, like you saw in my screenshot here, where synchronized journals red, other transactions are red, that just means that you don't have permission to that item in QuickBooks. And the log file will tell you that. It'll say, the current user does not have permission to journal entries. So just be aware of that you can definitely run sync. It's not going to cause any problems. It's just going to skip over those transaction types that you don't have access to. These questions come up a lot, and this is the last segment, and we'll jump into the demo. The Intuit data file needs to be very, very close in synchronization with ACCTivate. And some of the problems we ran into, and I just need to make sure I put this out there so if it comes up, you'll be prepared for it, is that any adjustments to those internal identifiers, such as a list ID or a TXN ID, can cause problems with our synchronization because we rely upon those to know which records match. So if you do work with Intuit or any third-party data services to do maintenance on your QuickBooks file, just be sure you ask the right questions and let them know that you are using an integrated application like ACCTivate, and they will advise you on whether they will be damaging those internal keys. Not very common, but I've actually heard rumors that the database verify and rebuild can sometimes actually recreate list IDs or TXN IDs. So what I recommend is get corresponding backups. Make sure you back up both your ACCTivate data file and your QuickBooks data file at the same time before doing any maintenance, just to be sure that if there are any problems, we can always go back to that backup and either roll back if it was a complete failure, or we can actually look at the old data to figure out what the ID values were before and what they are now, and we can assist you with trying to get those resynchronized. So we understand at some point, your data file could become damaged in QuickBooks, and as a last resort, they're rebuilding your file for you. That's fine, we understand it, but just make sure you've got a backup before that happens. Okay. And lastly, here on the screen, I just want to put this up there. Be very sure that you have a backup file, not just the raw data file. So for QuickBooks, that's going to be a QBB file. We really, really recommend the QBB file. That's a full database backup. There's also a portable company file, which is acceptable, but it's just not recommended. I think you do lose some of the template data and some of the other QuickBooks information if you only get a portable company file. And the same goes for ACCTivate. You want to grab the BKF or maybe a BAK backup file. Don't grab the raw SQL data files. Those are not easy to restore. Okay, we're going to start off in QuickBooks. I'm going to go through a couple kind of prerequisites before we launch ACCTivate and talk about synchronizing data. The first thing is when you open the QuickBooks file, definitely be aware of where that file is located. That's important for ACCTivate, and making sure that you're opening it in the same location is very important. I noticed a lot of you actually will have other company files that you've opened in the past, and you just have to tell your users, make sure you use this one. Well, what you can do in the newer versions, and I think this has been around for a couple of years, you can actually hit edit list, and then you can actually choose which company files you want to hide, and then hit OK, and it will remove them from the list. So be sure to clean up that list and get only the files that you want to have. Now, if you just launch ACCTivate or QuickBooks, a lot of times it's going to default to the last company you had open. I actually hit cancel on that to get to this screen. So it's now showing me this every time I log in. Anyways, if you see this list, definitely edit it, get it cleaned up so you're in the right company file. So we're logged in as a full admin and we're in single user mode, but on the file menu, as I was talking about earlier, as you're probably all aware of, we can switch to single user or multi-user mode. Should not matter for this. But what I want to jump into now is just talking about what part we play with QuickBooks. So we'll start off immediately by going to Preferences on the Edit menu. You will need to be logged in as an admin to see any of this information. But I want to go through kind of the concepts of the Integrated Applications list. So in Integrated Applications, you can choose Company Preferences, and these are, I'm going to remove some of these just to show you how it works. These are the third-party applications that are synchronizing data with your QuickBooks file. Okay? If you select ACCTivate in the list, you can hit Properties, and there will be a pop-up window that appears with more of the details of what security level you're allowing this application to touch your QuickBooks data. On the Detail tab, you'll have some information about when it was last accessed, when you last used it, and when you first accessed it. Now, every once in a while, if you've been using ACCTivate for more than 3 or 4 years, you may actually have more than one ACCTivate listed. The ones that are expired, that were last accessed a couple years ago, the reason why Intuit does that periodically is they cache our digital signature, I'll put it that way. And that's a way of ensuring that we are who we say we are and someone's not taking advantage of your financial data. Okay, so back to access rights. You've got a lot of options here. The number one requirement is you have to allow this application to read the QuickBooks data. If this is not checked, then that will prevent ACCTivate from doing anything with this QuickBooks file. If you start a copy of this QuickBooks file that you want to do for archival purposes, just open integrated applications and you can definitely uncheck that box, and that'll make sure that we never synchronize with that company file again. But for most of you, you'll need to keep that checked. The second part I think is pretty important, which is, do you want to allow ACCTivate to log in automatically to QuickBooks? So this will allow you to synchronize with QuickBooks even when QuickBooks is not running. And right here we'll have a list of users. By default, I've just got my admin account, and then we have one bookkeeper, Judy, who does accounts receivable. That's all we have in our system. So what I'm going to recommend, and I'll show you in a minute, is how to create a new user called ACCTivate that we'll use for synchronization. And then right here, this checkbox, which was not checked in this case, I would definitely recommend that you check this. And the main reason is not for Social Security numbers. We don't do anything with employee data or other personal data, but we do work with credit cards. If you check that box, that will allow ACCTivate to push credit card numbers into QuickBooks. However, even with it checked, no third-party software can read credit card numbers out of QuickBooks. So we would love to keep it two-way sync, and we have a strong encryption on the credit card numbers. We feel confident about that. But the problem is Intuit has just said across the board they will not allow third parties to read credit card numbers. So just keep in mind this is pushing data into QuickBooks. That's the only thing that it actually does now. And that's as of 2008. Okay, so we can hit OK on that. Integrated applications, you should see ACCTivate right here in the list. Now, as I said, I recommend that you create a new user for ACCTivate Sync. So if you go to Set Up Users and Roles, then you can actually hit the New button, and we can actually just call it ACCTivate, assign it a password, and then we can give it probably full access to everything, because this record is going to have to create journal entries, accounts receivable, accounts payable. You could turn off some of these, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to keep most of them turned on. I think the only ones that we're really not going to mess with would be like payroll processor. We don't need time tracking, no payroll manager. But we do need finance access. That includes the accounts like general ledger accounts, asset accounts, liability accounts. We definitely need that information. Okay. So we'll hit OK. Once you've created that new ACCTivate user, we can go back to Preferences, and now we can select that to run synchronization when QuickBooks is not running. Okay, so now that that's running, I'm going to go ahead and open ACCTivate. We'll log in. Okay, this is just our demo company, Southwestern Industries. Most of you should have access to that. If you do want to open the demo company and do any testing, it's going to be a really old QuickBooks file. You will need to upgrade that QuickBooks file to the current version of QuickBooks. We've started with kind of the least common denominator, so we can run sync with 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Once you've upgraded a QuickBooks file to a newer version, you cannot downgrade it. So that's the explanation there. Okay, so just to get started, make sure everything's working right, we can just run synchronization from the QuickBooks menu, and we can hit Begin. And that's going to connect to QuickBooks for the first time in this session. And we're going to see green checks for everything in the list, I hope. And we're done. So at this point, the next step is to hit View Log. That will open a text file. It's pretty basic. It's going to have the timestamp in which it opened the QuickBooks file, the file path where it found the QuickBooks file, and then the fact that it completed successfully. So, that took all of 10 seconds. The next thing I would recommend, if you are the user doing synchronization, or you can help out the person who is, instead of having to go to the QuickBooks menu and then choose Sync, you can actually hit this blue button on our icon bar, and you can actually add synchronization. Just go over to icon bar, scroll down until you see the Synchronize button, and you can actually check that box, and then that will make it available on your toolbar. So now instead of having to go to the menu each time, I can just single click, open the synchronization, and then begin. Now on this window, as you probably noticed here, there's quite a few options. The full synchronization is going to do every single record that's available, including customer, vendor transactions, journal entries, all the advanced data. There are options to only synchronize certain records under accounts receivable and payables. If you have a very large file that's taking maybe 30 seconds or a minute to sync, you could choose this to really, really quickly just sync your vendor list, and then choose None for accounts receivable. And if I hit begin there, instead of 10 seconds, it should probably only take about 3 or 4 seconds. Okay, so now if I go and look at my log, it's, I guess, 5 seconds, so it's a lot faster. Okay. Now if we go back to QuickBooks, as I said, I can close QuickBooks and it will actually synchronize as Activate. Not a big deal, but I do want to show you some of the constraints we talked about and some of the warnings and errors that might show up in your log file. So if I just go to look at some invoices in QuickBooks, this is an invoice that came from Activate. And just to reiterate, our item list is our product classes. So they're going to appear as non-inventoried parts, which we turn off inventory in QuickBooks. So once you're using Activate, we are responsible for all the inventory transactions, so you will no longer have any inventory part items in QuickBooks. If you do, we recommend you mark them as inactive. Activate should have done that during your go live, so maybe they were added after the fact or something happened there. So definitely let us know if you have any active inventory parts, but they should be marked as inactive. You should only see these product class items. So we've got the product class. The description will be the Activate part number, the Activate product ID, followed by a hyphen, and then the entire description of that product ID. The class, a QuickBooks class, can be assigned by branch is our most common way of doing that. So if you want to assign classes for the invoice header at the very top here, and then for all the line items, there's an option to do that. So that's in configuration management. And I'll show you just a couple of the options in config in a few minutes. And then the taxable status, whether it's taxable or non, all comes over from Activate. The PO number is synchronized. So if you had a PO number, that would be here. But any additional like notes, and there's a lot of items that may not appear in QuickBooks. QuickBooks is mostly the financial AR invoice. We expect that you're printing your invoices out of Activate, so all the customization to the invoice should be done in Activate. Now we're going to get into just start with an invoice, and then we'll go on to some other transactions. But I do want to show you the scenario that I warned about, which is changing any information on the inventory invoice in QuickBooks. So I have a shipping charge here that's $250. Well, that was a mistake. It should have been $200. So of course, QuickBooks doesn't have any way to block or add business rules from Activate. So when I make a change to that invoice, Intuit's going to let you do it. So I just reduced our invoice by $50. I can hit save, and that's it. It goes away, it's saved. Now, if I go back to the invoice in Activate, that same invoice is going to be for the original $250. So if we run another synchronization, instead of getting our green check on invoices, but you'll actually see an exclamation mark, or any non-green check needs to be reviewed. So in this case, we have the synchronized invoices has a warning icon. Now, what that means is there's a warning. It doesn't block the synchronization, but it did warn you that something's happened and you need to take a look at it. So we can hit view log, and now we're going to get a warning here that the amount of invoice B339Z has changed from $24,426.62 to $24,372.50. So what I can do is I can look up that invoice and find out what happened. You know, there's could be a million changes for that caused that. Intuit doesn't give us a log of exactly what user changed what item on the invoice, but you can figure it out pretty easily. So at that point, we can go back into QuickBooks and revert the change, or we can just leave it alone. If you leave it alone, we're not going to change it. So in QuickBooks now, our revenue is going to be based on that number, the $24,372. But in Activate, our product sales reports and our invoice register will still be on the original amount. So I would definitely recommend you take a look at those warnings, and they will appear in the log file just temporarily, and then they'll go away after a certain time period. So be sure you're reviewing these warnings and making sure they're resolved before they get buried in the synchronization. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a couple other things we can do in terms of invoicing. I'm going to start off with a new sales order, and we'll add an item. I just want to show you one thing that does come up from time to time, and it's a good concept to get. If we go and enter a sales order for $50 for these black buttons, and let's go ahead and record a payment with that, and we'll just do a cash payment, simple $50 cash payment. When I first create that invoice, the invoice will be created and the payment will be created in ACCTivate. So it's good to recognize that ACCTivate does have the ability to record payments with an invoice or with the order. So at the bottom of that, you'll see payment received cash, $50. So at this point, it was a normal transaction. We would run synchronization. It's going to go through to QuickBooks with a payment, paid in full, and we're done. The thing to be aware of, though, is if you void an invoice before it has synchronized, you're going to get a message that it will also delete the payment because it has not synchronized. So if you did it really fast and it's before your next sync, then we expect that there was a mistake and you're just correcting a mistake. Okay. Now I can choose no, not to void that. Once I synchronize, it will not void that payment. So you will not see that warning that the payment will be deleted, because we cannot delete a payment. Once it's in QuickBooks, it can be deposited and then we can't touch it. So it's just good to note that anytime you delete an invoice, if it had a payment, then you need to be aware that payment is still going to be in QuickBooks unless none of it has synchronized yet. We jumped right into invoices. That's probably the most common kind of transaction, which we'll get back to more on that. The other thing I want to do is talk about the list names. Now, as I said in the earlier presentation, customer, vendor, employee names all must be unique. So we've got a list of customers here, such as Adams, Abercrombie, Barley, Bayshore. If I were to go create a new customer here, let's say we call it Alterity. It's our company name here. Six Flags Drive. Okay, and then we'll put a phone number down here. I guess I could put our real number there. Okay, so I've created a customer record in ACCTivate. If I run synchronization, that customer record will appear in QuickBooks, which is normal. All of you have probably seen that. It's real easy. Just do it. It works. Easy. But some of the problems arise when you've got maybe multiple users in the company. Maybe Alterity is a new customer and we want to get a payment. We received a check, a down payment or deposit. So the user in QuickBooks wants to enter that record at the same time. I just want to make you aware of this, that if you can do that now. You can type in customer name Alterity, company name Alterity, put in the address here. The problem comes in when there's a conflict. So if let's say we were at a different address here, 100 Six Flags Drive, and we had our 800 number. Just put some bogus number, doesn't matter. Okay, so we hit OK here. So when we hit OK and save that record in QuickBooks, and when we saved it in ACCTivate, we had no way of knowing that there was another user using a different software at the same time. So when we run synchronization, you just need to be aware of this. ACCTivate does support that. It will merge those records together. Actually, QuickBooks merges the records together. The problem with it is it will keep the most recent record that was synchronized. So you're actually going to see a warning, but you do need to review those records. So it's going to tell us that new customer Alterity already exists and was merged. Please review it in ACCTivate before the next sync. So what's happened is now you need to be careful and make sure that it didn't change the data. And in this case it did, because I put in wrong information or different information. I'm not sure which one's right. So these are brand new records that were entered today, and it's going to keep the newest out of the two. So the newest, the latest wins. That's a pretty common concept. Just be aware that if you do see that warning, you do need to take heed and actually take a look at that warning and figure out what to do about it. So in this case, the QuickBooks was the newer record, so we lost the address that we had in ACCTivate because QuickBooks took over on that record. Okay, so duplicates are supported in that case. Now there's another error. This one is pretty common too. A lot of new accounts have this problem. So we're going to call this one Acme. And I'm just going to leave it really blank because none of the rest matters today. So now, instead of a customer, let's create a vendor named Acme. And this vendor is a totally different company. Well, it's same company name, but let's say it's a different company, Acme Corp. And that's going to be Dallas, Texas. Okay, so when I run synchronization now, instead of merging the records, because you can't combine a customer and a vendor, we're actually going to get a message about a duplicate name. And this is the Intuit error message. It's a little vague, but hopefully you'll you'll understand it. So if we merge the records, we actually have the warning icon with an exclamation mark, but it's a synchronization conflict, we're going to get a red X. So I'll view log. This error will not go away. Warnings are just temporary. You need to look at them each time they're in the log and then they'll drop out. But an error message will block every synchronization of that customer record till you resolve it. And in this case, it's error creating customer Acme. And back as I mentioned earlier, this is our internal GUID. That is the key. It's mostly for tech support's purpose here. If there was a conflict, we can use that to make sure we're looking at the right record. But here it says the name Acme of the list element is already in use. That's Intuit's way of saying that name is already in use, you can't use it. Now, if it was a customer, it would have merged. We would have been fine. But it's not a customer, it's a vendor. So that's when we need to switch back to QuickBooks. And we need to find it. So of course, if you go to the customers list, you will not see an Acme. There's no Acme there. If you can't find it, also be sure that you're looking at all records, not just active only. So switch it back to all customers. And then we can go to employees. We don't have that many employees. We can go to all employees. We don't have an Acme employee. So it's obviously vendors. And we'll see Acme right here. And as I mentioned earlier, what we recommend, and this also is Intuit's recommendation, add vendor as a suffix in the vendor's name. And then once we save this record, this will allow ACCTivate to create the new customer record with just their name. And there is logic behind renaming the vendor. The vendor name is not visible very much. It can show up on a purchase order, that sort of thing, but you have two options. In customers, there is only one real field for the customer's name. But if you go to the payment settings tab, the vendor record also has a print name on check option. So when you get the bill from them, it's going to have their name on it, of course. When you write the check will not be made out to Acme vendor. It'll be made out to Acme Corp. So this is kind of a good workaround, and that's the recommended solution, is to put vendor at the top. If it's too long, if your field names are huge, you could just do a V or something like that. But I like vendor. I think it's probably the easiest way to do that. And if you had a single person, so let's say Bob Smith buys from you, he's a customer, he used to be a vendor, now we've hired him, and now he's an employee, you'll probably need to do the same thing. So the employee name would be Bob Smith employee, and then you can set print name on check as his first name and last name only. Okay, so once I've done that, I can switch back to ACCTivate. I can synchronize again. And that error should be resolved, and it will turn from the red X back to a green check. Now, while we're waiting for this to finish, I think it's also very important for me to mention this. If the customer fails to synchronize, then you're going to have other problems. And some of those problems, as I'll show you right now, I've already set up kind of a staged issue here. Every record that depends on a customer in QuickBooks is going to fail to sync until we resolve that customer name issue. So if we have an Adams paper customer and we immediately set up a new customer record, and then we're going to enter a sales order for 100 units of these D-ring binders, okay, and then we're going to go ahead and create a payment as well, say cash payment $362.55, and we're going to create the invoice. Nothing in ACCTivate has touched QuickBooks yet, so we're not going to block the invoice. We're able to create it, $335, it's done. We got the payment, customer walks out with our goods. So now when I go to synchronize, we're not only going to get a red X on the customer, we should also get, hopefully I've got this set up still, let's see. Yeah, we got a red X on the customer. We're also going to get an error on the invoice and payments or any data related to that customer record. So this is the actual error, and then these are warnings because we're unable to create the invoice until you get that customer to sync. So if I choose view log, we're going to have 3 errors here. Number 1, cannot create customer Adams paper, and then later on we're going to have an invoice warning because customer Adams paper is not synced to QuickBooks yet. Then we have a payment. The payment can't go because the invoice hasn't synchronized to QuickBooks yet. Now I'm going to kind of get into where this becomes a big problem. Let's say we noticed that all of our other customer records synchronized today, only one record didn't go through. No big deal. We'll resolve this later. Wait till Mike gets back in from vacation, or just delay that. The problem is, as long as you have that error message in synchronized customers, it's going to slow your synchronization down every day. Because what ACCTivate does is we keep track of the last date and time that you had a successful synchronization for every step. So what happens here is that we're going to keep running synchronization all the way back till today for the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, months, year. If you keep that error in there, it's going to really slow your sync down. So you're going to go from 30 seconds to 3 minutes to 30 minutes, and then eventually you're going to get really frustrated when it takes an hour to run synchronization. And then you call us. But really, what you need to do is try to keep these errors resolved as you go along, and that will take care of it, and that will make sure you keep a really smooth running synchronization. So at this point, I know that it's a duplicate name, so I've set up my vendor in the background here. I'll go down to Adam's paper. I'll add the vendor suffix to avoid that conflict. I'll hit OK. Go back to ACCTivate, synchronize later. And we saw that since we had the green check on customers, now the invoice was able to sync, and finally the payment. Okay, and we can switch back into QuickBooks, and we can verify that in our customer center we have the invoice and the payment for Adam's paper. Now while I'm here, we've got another couple topics. One of the things is that invoices are owned by ACCTivate, so any changes to that invoice, including the product ID over here, if I just change that to B15, that's not going to affect our inventory. So again, we would need to void and recreate that invoice over in ACCTivate. However, we do not own the payments. Accounts receivable, including the payments, credit memo applications, these are owned by QuickBooks because it does not affect inventory. It's at the AR level, the accounts receivable level. So you can unapply this payment, and we can apply it to a different invoice. We could do anything we want. We could delete the payment. So we could actually just say, nope, he did not pay us cash. And that's not going to be a warning or any problem. It's simply going to reopen that invoice in ACCTivate. So if I open that customer record today, we'll see that that invoice right there has a payment, $362.65 cash. Now to view the details of that, if you open the invoice record on the transactions tab, that's where you will see any cleared payments, cash, credit cards. So if I run synchronization again, it will actually delete that payment and unapply it and then delete it because QuickBooks owns the payment. So we'll take care of that. So if we refresh, now we will see the invoice with an open balance. Now, we don't own the payment, but we do own the invoice. So one thing that is a common issue is if you want to delete this invoice, like void it, QuickBooks will allow you to do it. So if you're an admin or you have AR permissions, you can delete the transaction. And it goes away instantly, but it's still an ACCTivate. So when we run synchronization now, that invoice, it's not going to get deleted out of ACCTivate. That's my bottom line. Because it's an inventory invoice that's owned by ACCTivate, we will show a warning message in the log, and we will actually recreate that invoice in QuickBooks. So here's your message right here. That invoice was deleted from QuickBooks. ACCTivate will recreate it because that's an inventoried invoice. If you really want to void it, what you need to do is take that invoice number into ACCTivate. You can either find it by customer or go straight to it from the customer invoice window. You need to find out what it is, of course, if you need to delete it, and you can delete it from the original sales order window, which will reopen that order. So on the Invoices tab, I can select that invoice, choose Void Invoice, and now that will properly delete the invoice, remove the cost of goods sold, reinstate the inventory as if the invoice never took place. So you need to void and recreate ACCTivate records in ACCTivate if it's an invoice or anything like that. A couple other more just kind of technical things that I want to bring up so you're not intimidated if you see this. As we started off with earlier, now that we're running sync on a day-to-day basis, you could have a problem where ACCTivate, when you go to run a sync, and I'm just kind of going to simulate this, but as we said earlier, maybe QuickBooks rebuilt your QuickBooks file. Something happened where Activate lost our connection. If we run a sync, you're going to get a message in QuickBooks, and I want to kind of stop right here and explain this to you. So this is the QuickBooks application certificate, and you will usually see these maybe after you rebuild your file or you start with the data services and they create a new file. But what I talked about earlier, you will be prompted, do you want to allow Activate, right, to connect to your QuickBooks file? And we highly recommend that you choose either number 3 or 4 is probably going to be what you want to do. Number 3 requires that some user be logged into QuickBooks and open anytime we run sync. Now, the 4th option here allows you to run sync as a named user, even if QuickBooks is not open. Okay, so what I recommend is you choose the last option, have a user ID called Activate, and then be sure to check this option if you're dealing with credit card numbers. Once you hit continue, it's going to give you a little summary. We'll choose done. That will allow Activate to synchronize with QuickBooks. Once you have set that option up in Edit Preferences, Integrated Applications, or on that little pop-up window, at this point now I can actually log out of QuickBooks, close QuickBooks, and I can continue to run synchronization even without QuickBooks open and logged in. So the reason why I want to kind of bring this up and go through it, this allows you to set up QuickBooks on a user's computer that doesn't necessarily have access to QuickBooks. They can't log in and use it, but they do need to have Activate get up-to-date information into QuickBooks all day. So if you're the financial manager and you want to log in and make sure it's always up to date, but you don't use Activate, you should set up QuickBooks on their workstation, but don't provision them with a user account in QuickBooks. Don't give them the password, and it will simply open QuickBooks automatically in the background. You will not see QuickBooks. They won't be able to do anything with it, and then they can use Activate to push the records into QuickBooks. Okay, while that's finishing, just one other comment. The last thing that I just want to touch on, at the very bottom here, you have the synchronized changes since, last sync, closing date, or first QB use. I would strongly encourage you not to use the last 2 options. In fact, if you try to do it, you're going to get a big message. If we go all the way to first QB use, it's going to take many hours to run. It will literally reload every transaction from QuickBooks and Activate into memory and walk through them looking for any discrepancies. Okay, so we strongly would recommend you don't do this until you've talked to our tech support team, but I just want to make sure we covered it so you understand what that is. It literally just loads the entire database and goes through all the records. So what that means, first QB use is the entire database. Closing date is load every record based on transaction dates since your last closing date in QuickBooks. And then last synchronization is going to keep up with a timestamp, as we call it. It's going to keep up with the timestamps for each synchronization. So it'll be really, really fast because you're only loading data that's changed since the last time you ran sync. Now there's one catch on that. Your normal daily synchronizations, it's not down to the minute. So if I run a synchronization now, it's 2:05 my time. If I run a synchronization right now, you would expect that it would only load records that have been modified since about 2:02 or 2:01 p.m., the last time I ran sync. But really what we have to do is we have to account for the fact that QuickBooks uses the local time from each user. So what we do is we try to make sure we catch any problems where your different computers may have different times of the day. So you may not be in synchronization with your Windows clock. So we add an additional 24 hours onto synchronization. So when you run sync, we're actually loading all records that have changed since yesterday at this time. Okay. Now one other thing, and this is simulated, but let's just pretend we're running sync, and another user on another computer is also running sync. And this is a problem that I just want to make sure we go through. If you're running synchronization on this computer, each step, such as invoices, customers, payments, needs to be single user. So even if you're logged into multi-user mode, which I guess you have to be to get to this point, we could have another user, and in this case, if you look at the message on the screen, Judy Jones started synchronization a while back, and she's in the middle of doing synchronization of payments, but it's hung up for some reason. It's taking a little longer, and you caught up to her. It's like a race, and you caught up to her, but you can't pass her. You have to wait for her to finish before you can load payments. And the reason why we can't overlap is we really want to avoid the potential of two users creating the same transaction in QuickBooks. Okay, so there's two options here. We can actually wait for that user to complete, and if we choose yes, then that will just retry a couple times until she doesn't have the lock anymore. Okay, so if we just wait a few minutes, we can give her time to finish it, or you can run down the hall and say, "Hey, Judy, are you still synchronizing? What's going on?" Now, another option is to bypass that. You don't have to wait. So if you choose yes, it's going to retry up to 5 times, I think. So it just takes a few seconds because we're hoping that she's kind of at the end of it. So it's going to count down a few times, and if she doesn't release the lock, you're going to get a final message that says, "Hey, she never finished. Do you want to bypass this warning and go ahead and run sync?" Okay, so in that case, let's hurry it up. Okay, continue waiting. You can just hit yes and sit here all day, or run down the hall. But if you choose no, this will allow you to synchronize if her computer crashed or QuickBooks stopped responding. Maybe something bad happened. So it should be fine if she's really not running sync to hit OK, and that's going to load that record that she was in the middle of synchronizing. Double check it and then continue on. Okay, so we're done. Synchronization completed, and we can close out. Now, again, the tech support, I've showed the sync log a number of times. If you've already ran sync and you lost the log, you can always go on the help menu to activate support, email log file, and you can view either the most recent synchronization log, which is clean, nothing's in it. You can open the folder to view Windows Explorer, which will show you your last 10 synchronization logs. And these files are numbered 0 through 9. You can actually choose to open those in Notepad. They're just all the same. They're text files, even though they have that weird extension. So if we ran sync again and you're like, "Oh, I lost that warning. Who was it?" You can go back and look at it in the last 10 sync logs. And then, of course, we have dated logs that include every single detail of every record ever created. So if we go to August 20th and I choose View, not only will this have the synchronization, the last 10, it will actually have every synchronization that I've ran all day. So you can kind of scroll through here and you'll see all the warnings forever. Okay, and those log files are also available to tech support, so we may ask you to send us that log file. Okay, so we've gone through a lot of information about QuickBooks Sync. I'm definitely running out of time here, so just to kind of close up here, this is a huge topic area. We have a lot of customers that ask us, about how data synchronize is with QuickBooks. I definitely couldn't cover everything today. In fact, I could barely touch on some of the records that we sync with QuickBooks. But hopefully I've given you a little bit of a background in terms of how we synchronize data and some red flags to watch out for, like resolving your errors as soon as possible, making sure that you've got really good backups of the QuickBooks data file, like a QBB file, and a matching ACCTivate backup file at the same point in time before you do any maintenance or just as a daily backup. Be aware of what the maintenance on the data file does, such as a rebuild or condense. Be aware of those internal IDs, that they are important. So anytime you're working with a third party or Intuit, just be aware that you could be damaging the link to ACCTivate. And then also we talked a little bit about users. Be sure to take a look at the way that you are synchronizing with ACCTivate, so which user we are connecting as, and that's under Edit Preferences in QuickBooks. And then lastly, stay up to date on QuickBooks. The annual releases are just the start. The R1 is the initial release 1. Every year there's 8, 9, 10, sometimes more releases that come out for your QuickBooks file. So whenever you get a prompt to do the automatic update, maybe you don't have to do every single one, but try to stay somewhat up to date, because they really do fix problems. And we've seen some problems reported by customers in older versions, and then when we've tested the problem on a newer version of QuickBooks, it's resolved. So just be aware that they have fixed some problems that we don't even really understand what happened there. And as always, if you have any questions, definitely reach out to our implementation or support teams. We can answer any of your questions about the way QuickBooks works. And definitely check out our help site at help.activate.com and do a quick search for any sync errors that you have or warnings or information messages. And hopefully you'll find what you're looking for. If not, let us know and we'll get that information to you. And thank you very much for joining us today and have a wonderful afternoon.